Hello class, so this week's lecture is based on plate tectonics, and I first wanted to start off with the continental drift theory. So the continental drift theory was proposed by Alfred Wegener in 1912, and he proposed that 200 million years ago, a supercontinent called Pangaea began to break apart into the present continents that we see today. So over time, each landmass slowly drifted across to its current position. And in this map, we see a supercontinent called Pangaea, and there is a combination of all the continents as one. So this theory was supported in World War II with growing evidence found in rock magnetism, distribution of earthquakes, and mapping the seafloor. And I wanted to provide all these maps to show how Pangaea broke apart. And Pangaea broke apart during the Triassic era, as we can see here. And the reason Pangaea broke apart was due to continental rifting, which we will learn later in the lecture. And we can see the separation of this supercontinent and how it looks today in the present day. So with the supporting evidence behind the continental drift theory, this led to the development of a more comprehensive model known as the theory of plate tectonics. And the theory of plate tectonics is based on the Earth's lithosphere, and the Earth's lithosphere is broken into several large rigid slabs called lithospheric plates, or simply plates. And the lithosphere consists of continental crust and oceanic crust. So as we can see in this diagram, I wanted to provide this to see how the continental crust and the oceanic crust, how they move on Earth. So the reason for their movement is due to the convection cells. So here we can see that hot magma is rising above the core. So as it rises to the surface, the hot magma begins to cool and it's moved horizontally, and that movement is what causes the oceanic crust or the continental crust to move. And again, the magma, as it cools, it sinks back down and it returns and repeats the same process. So the movement of the convection cell is what causes the lithospheric plates to move across Earth. And this map is showing you the main tectonic plates found on Earth, and there are 15. For example, we have the North American plate and the Eurasian plate. So these plates, they can either be only continental crust, or they can be an oceanic crust, or they can be a combination of both. So for example, the North American plate, it has the continental crust as well as the oceanic crust, whereas the Nazca plate, it only has the oceanic crust. And you can see the lines that are separating these two plates, and this is known as plate boundaries. So these lines are known as plate tectonic boundaries, and there are three types of boundaries, which are convergent boundary, divergent boundary, and transform boundary. And we will go more in depth within each diagram, but for the most part, convergent boundary is when plates are pushed towards each other, so they're colliding into each other, and divergent boundary is where two plates move apart from each other, and the transform boundary is caused by shear stress, whereby plates slide past each other. So in this example, we could see that the North American plate and the Eurasian plate, they are separating from each other. And I don't know if you could see that clearly, but the red arrows are showing that they're moving away from each other. Whereas in this example, the Nazca plate is colliding into the South American plate, so this is a convergent boundary. So I want to go more in depth with the convergent boundary. So again, we're looking at the interaction between the oceanic crust and the continental crust within each major type of boundary. So for the convergent boundary, for when oceanic crust collides into the continental crust, as we can see in this diagram, we can see that the oceanic crust is sinking underneath the continental crust. And the reason for that is because the oceanic crust is more dense and it's more denser than the continental crust. So since it's more dense, it's going to sink, and as it sinks, the magma is heating up, and the magma is rising, creating the volcanic arc on the continental land, as well as the formation of earthquakes. So due to the movement hitting against the other continental crust, it's creating earthquakes. And again, another feature that you'll find in a convergent boundary is a trench in the ocean. So an example of the oceanic to continental crust is in South America, the Andes Mountains. So this is showing you the volcanic arc found on the continent. And next we have the convergent boundary, and this for the continental with continental. So when a continental collides into another continental crust, they will build up the material of the crust together and form huge mountain ranges. And the reason for that is because the continental crust, they're less dense and very thick, so there's no subduction occurring. So instead, you're just going to get a buildup of the continental crust colliding into each other, forming these gigantic mountain range. So in this example, this is the Himalaya Mountains, and this was formed due to the collision of two continental crusts slamming into each other. So next we have the oceanic crust colliding into another oceanic crust, and again you have the same features that we see when an oceanic crust collides with the continental crust, except it's occurring in the middle of the ocean. So for example, we see the oceanic crust is colliding into this other oceanic crust, and the older, more dense crust is the one that sinks underneath the other oceanic crust. And again, there's a formation of a trench, as well as a line of volcanoes are starting to form as well, also known as the island arc. And an example is the Aleutian Islands. And in this image, it's showing you a volcanic eruption occurring in one of the Aleutian Islands, but you can see that there's a line of volcanoes here. So again, this is an example of two oceanic plates colliding into each other and one of them subducting, creating the island arc. Also, for the next major type of boundary, we have the divergent boundary, where two plates are moving away from each other, and it could occur in the ocean, which we see in this diagram of these two plates moving away from each other, or it could occur on land, which is called the continental rift zone, which we will see in the next couple of slides. So for the mid-ocean ridge, this occurs where two plates move apart, resulting in the upwelling of hot material from the mantle to create new seafloor, also known as mid-ocean ridges. So we have the lava rising, the magma rising, and the lava erupts, and it's forming new oceanic crust at the mid-ocean ridge. And as this new oceanic crust is forming, it is pushing the old oceanic crust outward, and where the old oceanic crust as it's getting pushed outwards, again, it's going to end up subducting underneath the continental lithosphere. And we learned that this process is the convergent boundary, but we're focusing on divergent boundaries. So again, it's the movement of two plates moving away from each other that we see here. So it creates mountain ranges in the ocean. And yeah, so that's what occurs in the mid-ocean ridge. And an example is the mid-Atlantic ridge, which occurs in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And we are going to take a look at that. So this map is showing you the mid-Atlantic ridge. So this black line is the mid-Atlantic ridge, also known as the divergent boundary. So as we learned, new lava, as the magma rises, the lava erupts and creating new oceanic crust. So if we compare it to the age of these rocks, we see that the red zone, they're very young. So at the mid-Atlantic ridge, it's forming new oceanic crust at they're at a very young age. Whereas when you move away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, we see that these rocks that are pushed outwards, the oceanic crust as it's pushed outward, they are 180 million years old. So, and one way to look at it is that we learn that this oceanic crust is subducting into this continental crust. So as it subducts, we can see that at convergent boundaries, old oceanic crust is getting destroyed, whereas in the divergent boundary, new oceanic crust is forming. So in this slide, we're going to talk about continental rift zones. So this is how this was the process of how Pangaea was separated, and Pangaea was separated due to the formation of the Atlantic Ocean opening up and separating the continents. So looking at this diagram, we see that first, when there is a divergent boundary occurring on land, the magma rises beneath the continent, the crust thins, breaks, and then splits apart, and this first produces a rift valley, which we can see here. So this rift valley creates oceanic crust, so it's forming a new ocean basin, and then next thing you know, mature ocean is formed and it's separating the two continents. And we have again the mid-ocean ridge, which is a great example of the mid-Atlantic ridge and the formation of the Atlantic Ocean that separated the Pangaea continent. So again, an example is the East African Rift, which may eventually in the future create another whole new ocean. So here is a map that is an example of all the divergent boundaries found on Earth. So what we learned today was the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and these are other ones as well. So the third major type is the transform boundary, and this occurs where two plates grind past each other without the production or destruction of lithosphere. So in this map, this orange line represents the San Andreas Fault, and we know that the San Andreas Fault is in California, and the San Andreas Fault is the boundary between the Pacific Plate, which is on the left side, and the North American Plate on the right side. So the Pacific Plate is moving at a northeast direction, and the North American Plate is moving in a southwest direction. So these plates are sliding past each other, and this is an image of the San Andreas Fault. Again, the Pacific Plate on this side and the North American Plate on this side, and it's just sliding past each other, so there's no creation or destruction of the lithosphere, like we see in the convergent boundary where the oceanic crust is getting destroyed or the continental crust is getting destroyed, or like when we see with the divergent boundary where the creation of new oceanic crust is getting formed. So that's the difference between all the major types of boundaries. And also, I wanted to show the Pacific Ring of Fire. So the Ring of Fire is a path along the Pacific Ocean characterized by active volcanoes and frequent earthquakes. So as we can see here, the red dots represent volcanoes, and if we look at the symbology, the black line, the solid black line represents the convergent boundary, and this line represents divergent boundary. So we can see that volcanoes mainly occur along convergent boundaries, also known as subduction zones. So that will help you to answer one of the questions in your lab. So for your lab, you all will be working off of Google Earth. So please let me know if you have any questions regarding the lab, and thank you for watching.